All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful and, yeah, controversial ideas in all of history. Seriously, it's this concept that has pretty much shaped our modern world for centuries, and it's all fueled by this incredible dream of global peace. We're diving into the story of liberal internationalism. You know, it all really boils down to this one huge question that's haunted humanity forever. Can we actually create a world without war? Or is conflict just baked into our DNA? This is the massive problem that liberal internationalism, at its core, really dares to tackle. Okay, so what exactly is this idea? Well, at its heart, liberal internationalism is basically a giant no to the idea that endless war is our destiny. It says that the cynical game of power politics, the whole might makes right thing, isn't the only option. Instead, it puts its faith in something else: human reason, cooperation, and the rule of law. The belief is that these things can totally reshape how countries deal with each other. And to really get just how radical this was, we've got to jump in our time machine and go back to the beginning. Back to a time when the very idea of a structured, lasting peace, well, that was completely revolutionary. The great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant had a phrase for the world he saw around him: the lawless state of savagery. I mean, wow. Think about it. At a time when countries were starting to figure out things like rights and citizenship for their own people, the international stage was still just a brutal free-for-all, a total mess. That's the reality these thinkers were pushing back against. And this sets up a huge clash of ideas. On one side, you've got what's called the realist worldview. They look at the world and see, at best, a troubled peace that's always on the brink of war, all driven by fear and raw self-interest. But then, this new liberal vision comes along and proposes something totally different: a world run on things like moderation, self-restraint, and compromise. A complete 180. The pioneers of this first wave were some real heavy hitters. You had Immanuel Kant again, dreaming up this idea of a perpetual peace built on a federation of free countries. And then there's Jeremy Bentham, who, get this, literally invented the word international. He took his famous idea of the greatest happiness and thought, hey, why not apply this to the whole family of nations? Pretty groundbreaking stuff. So, for more than 100 years, these were mostly just ideas, things for thinkers to debate. But then came the absolute catastrophe of World War I. And suddenly, the world was desperate, truly desperate, for a new way of doing things. This desperation led to the first great real-world experiment in liberal internationalism, and, well, its first great failure. I mean, you just can't overstate the horror of the First World War. It completely shattered that old, cozy belief that peace was just the natural state of things. And here's the key takeaway, the big shift in thinking. If the world wanted peace, it wasn't just going to happen on its own. Nope, it had to be built. It needed, as one writer put it, consciously devised machinery. And what was this machinery? Well, it was built around this brand new idea called collective security. This was the engine that was supposed to power the new League of Nations. The idea was actually pretty simple, but really powerful. An attack on one country is an attack on all countries. Think of it like a global neighborhood watch, Everyone agrees to stand up to the bully on the block. So, great idea on paper, right? But in the real world, oof, it was a disaster. First, the US, the country that championed the whole thing, refused to even join. Then, the League just stood by, totally powerless, as Japan invaded Manchuria. Then it happened again when Italy conquered Ethiopia. By 1939, the dream was in absolute ruins. And you see, the big flaw in collective security was that it asked countries to risk going to war for abstract principles, even when their own immediate safety wasn't on the line. That's a tough sell. So why did it fall apart so spectacularly? Well, the historian E.H. Carr came in with this just devastating realist critique. He basically said, look, all these high-minded universal principles, they're not universal at all. He argued they were just a convenient mask, a way for the big-shot countries of the day, like Britain and France, to dress up their own self-interest and call it morality. But then, out of the ashes of an even worse conflict, World War II, the dream was reborn. They decided to give it another shot. Only this time, it was going to be rebuilt on much more pragmatic and, let's be honest, more powerful foundations. This was the birth of a whole new kind of world order. So after 1945, we get the United Nations. And it was built on one crucial lesson they learned from the League's spectacular failure. The big change? The UN gave the world's most powerful countries, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, veto power. It was a really pragmatic, almost cynical move. It was basically an admission that, hey, for this peace thing to actually work, we need the big guns on board and happy. The scholar John Eikenberry actually came up with a really useful way to think about this whole evolution. He calls that failed League of Nations experiment Liberalism 1.0. Then, the American-led order that came after World War II, that's Liberalism 2.0. And he even suggests we might be moving toward a Liberalism 3.0, a potential future that's not so dependent on just one superpower. But, and this is a huge but, this American-led order was never as clean or as noble as it sometimes sounded. From the very beginning, this whole idea has been haunted by a deep, really uncomfortable paradox, a kind of dark side, this persistent imperial impulse. And believe me, this isn't a new problem. Go all the way back to the 19th century, and you have a key liberal thinker, J.S. Mill, arguing that, well, barbarian peoples needed to be ruled by force. This created a kind of two-tiered world, and you can hear echoes of that logic even today, right? When the U.S. is called the indispensable nation, it's sometimes used to justify interventions that critics turn around and call a new kind of liberal imperialism. And that brings us right up to the present day. Because after decades of being the dominant system, that American-led Liberalism 2.0 is now facing, arguably, its biggest crisis ever. And the pressure is coming from both the outside and the inside. On the outside, you've got a massive challenge from rising powers, especially China. And here's the thing, they're not just asking for a seat at the existing table anymore. They're going out and building their own tables with huge projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. They're offering a completely different model for how the world can work, one that's not led by the West. So, what's really going on here? Why is the whole system starting to fray? Well, there are a few big reasons. For one, America's power just isn't what it used to be. It's not the only game in town. 2, these rising countries want a bigger say in how things are run. Makes sense. 3, a lot of nations are looking at the history of Western interventions and feeling like their own sovereignty is under threat. And finally, for some, that old bargain, adopt our liberal norms and you'll get rich, it just doesn't seem like such a great deal anymore. And remember, the pressure isn't just coming from the outside. The idea of liberalism is kind of having a fight with itself. On one side, you have the believers in imposition, the folks who say we should actively spread democracy and universal values, even if it means intervening in other countries. But on the other side, you have the advocates for restraint, who argue for the exact opposite, non-intervention, tolerance, and a much more pragmatic approach. This is the huge debate happening inside liberalism right now. So, okay, the system is getting hit from the outside, and it's divided on the inside. That leaves us with the million-dollar question, right? What happens now? And this is where we land on the biggest paradox of all. For all of its massive flaws, for its dark history with empire, liberal internationalism also gave the world the very language of universal rights. Think about that. The tools we use to criticize its injustices, ideas like self-determination and human rights, they came from inside the very system we're critiquing. It created its own harshest critics. So that leaves us with one last really challenging thought to chew on. Is this whole idea, with all of its contradictions and all of its historical baggage, a deeply flawed system that maybe we can't live without? Is it the worst way to organize the world, except for all the others?